What's up, everyone? Welcome to the NBA Daily Podcast. Today's April 8th, 2016. My name's Dawson Shine, and I'm your host. First off today, we're going to be talking about Sam Hinkie's resignation. Now, many of you probably know who he is, but if you don't, he's the former Philadelphia 76ers general manager and president of basketball operations. He's the man that basically ran the team. He decided which players would get signed, which would get traded, which would get drafted, and basically how much you'd pay them. So he was pretty important to the team. He's actually also the first person to really implement the strategy of rebuilding entirely through the draft, which, as many of you guys know, is called tanking. He purposely sabotaged the Philadelphia 76ers team to make it bad. That way, at the end of the season, they would have the worst record in the league and would be able to get a higher draft pick, thus hopefully picking up better players. He also did this through trading away good players on the team. Quite a few examples of this, actually. And today, we're going to be talking about whether or not he really improved this team by tanking it, or if he actually made it worse and sabotaged its future after he left. First off, I want to talk about some of the major trades he had while he was the Philadelphia 76ers GM. First one was the Drew Holiday-Pierre Jackson trade to the New Orleans Pelicans for Nerlens Noel and a first-round pick. Nerlens Noel, as many of you guys know, is the guy with the huge high top fade. He's also a monster on the defensive end, and he's a great center for the league. He's the defensive anchor for a pretty bad team, but he's actually really good, and he's young. Sixers hopefully had traded for him in order to get a future piece for a contender. He wasn't actually going to be playing his rookie season. He had torn his ACL when he got drafted. But the Sixers traded for him in order to have a draft and stash player, which means that they picked someone who would be able to play in the future at a really high level, but that most teams didn't want because they wouldn't be able to contribute right away. The next trade he did in order to get rid of some talent from the team was to trade Lavoy Allen and Evan Turner to the Indiana Pacers for Danny Granger in a 2015 second-round pick. And if you keep up with the Celtics or the Pacers, you'll know that both Lavoy Allen and Evan Turner have found very valuable roles on the bench for both of these teams, which really shows that this tanking strategy can hurt your team in the long run because you get rid of players that could eventually develop into NBA-caliber talent. His next trade was really controversial, which was Elfrid Payton, who's a point guard, pretty young. He traded him to the Orlando Magic for Dario Saric in a 2017 first-round pick. Now, that first-round pick is pretty valuable because Orlando could be very bad in 2017 and thus have a very high draft pick. However, Dario Saric is a player who's never played an NBA game, despite being in the league technically for 2 years. He still plays overseas and hasn't really developed the ability to come here and play and compete in the big boy league. Whereas Elfrid Payton is showing he can actually lead an NBA-caliber offense on his own as a point guard, and despite shooting deficiencies, shows he's a great passer and a rebounder. And if you haven't started to notice the trend here yet, it's the fact that he loved to trade away talent in order to build for a team later on in the draft. And the next thing he did really showed this, which was trading Thaddeus Young for a 2015 first-round pick, Luc Mbah a Moute, and Alexei Shved, in that big Kevin Love blockbuster trade 2 years ago, where Andrew Wiggins went to the Timberwolves and Love went to the Cavaliers to create the super team. And this was really controversial because Thaddeus Young looked like a very promising young power forward, and yet they traded him away because he was almost too good for the team. They were winning too many games with his help. And now I know that really sounds ridiculous. However, this Philadelphia team is one of the most crazy ideas ever. They tried to actually make their team worse and expected it to get better in the long run. And they made some very risky moves, such as trading away talent like Thaddeus Young, in order to do that. Another talent piece that they traded away was Michael Carter-Williams, MCW, which was actually their 11th round pick in the 2013 draft. They traded him to the Milwaukee Bucks in a 3-team trade involving the Suns, the Bucks, and the Sixers. And they only received back a Lakers first-round pick, which is top 3 protected, which means if the Lakers can get a top 3 pick in the draft this year, the Sixers get nothing for trading away their top draft pick of the 2013 draft. It's pretty crazy to think about. And the Lakers at the moment are the number 2 team in the draft, if everything goes well in the odds. And the final thing they did, which was this season, was trading 2 second-round picks to the New Orleans Pelicans for Ish Smith, who actually made them watchable this season, incredibly enough, because they were absolute trash on the court. Watching them made your eyes want to bleed. And honestly, they needed a little bit of a point guard. Because, as I'm going to go into next, their draft picks have been, well, less than planned out well. We'll say that. Because first off, they picked MCW, their 11th round pick in 2013. Now, he's a point guard, very tall, very long, can't shoot at all. So They picked him hoping that he would develop the shot, and he had some real promise his first couple of games of the season, including almost getting a quadruple double his first game in the NBA. It was incredible. He had 9 steals. It was absolutely ridiculous to watch. But he really fell off a cliff once teams realized that he could not shoot at all. They stopped defending him on the three-point line. They stopped closing out into shots. It made it harder to pass into the post, and it overall made the team have a lack of spacing, which limited their opportunities on offense. And for a young team with very limited abilities as it is, you can't really limit the spacing on offense and expect to succeed. Their next pick was really controversial. Joel Embiid, the third pick in the 2014 draft. Now, he has never played an NBA game yet. 2 years he's been in the league technically, and he's had foot surgery twice. He has not been able to get onto the court in order to play a game because of constant injuries. And it's really starting to look like he might never play. It does seem promising this season. It showed a lot of videos on Philadelphia 76ers social media about him practicing with the team. He's playing everything except for full court 5-on-5 contact basketball. And that's pretty promising, to be honest, because he looked like he was going to be a stud when he played at Kansas in the few games he could play without being injured. But the problem is, with someone as injury prone, as tall, and as skilled as that, they're going to keep paying him money, hoping that he eventually pans out, similar to how Greg Oden never panned out, but continued to get paid money when he got drafted. And it might never work out. He might never see the court in the NBA, or he might go on the court, be like Pekovic in Minnesota, and just get injured again, sit, get a big contract after he plays well for half a season, and then get injured again, sit, and repeat till the end of his career. So it's pretty controversial, but they went for it. Their next pick in that 2014 draft was Elfrid Payton, the 10th pick. Now, they actually traded him away. He was a really good point guard, and he still is. However, they decided to trade him away in order to get a draft and stash player in Dario Saric. Now, I don't know if you've noticed a pattern yet, but Philadelphia seems to never want to pick up a player that can play and contribute their first season in the NBA. First, they picked up Joel Embiid, who they knew would not be playing his first season because of injuries. They also picked up Nerlens Noel, who had a torn ACL his first season and was never going to see the court. They also traded for Dario Saric, who hasn't played in the NBA despite being on contract for 2 years. And then finally, they picked Jahlil Okafor this past year. He was the 3rd pick in the draft because, again, they did not get the first pick despite having a very poor season. And he played pretty well this season, but he had a lot of run-ins with trouble outside of the court. First, he had an altercation with a Boston fan, threatened him, tried to beat him up, which has been proven to be caused by the Boston fan. However, it does show a lack of veteran leadership keeping his head on straight, because the team obviously doesn't have very many veterans. He also had a problem with going 108 miles an hour on the highway, getting caught and getting a huge speeding fine. That's pretty fast for someone who can just buy a driver if he wants to. He doesn't need to worry about driving himself somewhere and racing his friends. Especially because if he gets injured, that's going to cost him millions and the Sixers millions. So it looks like they've really built a team that's for the future. However, the future may not ever come. A lot of their players have showed injuries like Embiid, showed lack of potential like Dario Saric, who still hasn't been able to come over to the NBA, or they traded away the talent they did have, like Elfrid Payton, Thaddeus Young, Evan Turner, Lavoy Allen, Drew Holiday, MCW, who's okay. And I mean, to me, it feels as though this team is just not going to get anywhere. Sam Hinkie tried to build the team through the draft and failed miserably at it. He really gave it a good shot, but the problem with building through the draft is it requires luck in the draft lottery, and they had none of it. Despite having the worst record or second worst record in the draft 3 times, they only ended up with a few third picks, and that's awful. They really got absolutely screwed in the draft lottery. Like last year when Minnesota got the first pick. Despite Philadelphia being the worst team throughout the entire year, they seemed to win just a little bit too many games at the end of the year, and it cost them. This year, however, they are decidedly the worst team, so we'll see if they can actually succeed in getting the first round pick like they've been so trying to do for the past few years. But despite having some of the worst teams of all time, they haven't even shown any sign of improvement on the court. They continue to be one of the worst offensive teams and defensive teams in the league. They just don't have any talent to spare on offense. They show a few bright spots, such as Robert Covington this year with his shooting, or Ish Smith running the point guard. But Jahlil Okafor and Nerlens Noel have shown that they really can't play together. They're both centers. They wanted to try Nerlens Noel at the power forward, but he couldn't do it. He couldn't shoot at all. Neither can Jahlil Okafor. And on top of those two centers, very young and very promising, they have Joel Embiid hopefully coming back next season. That's three very promising young centers on their roster. Not one good shooting guard or point guard to be found. So it really leaves us with a lot to think about on whether or not tanking is the best strategy. But we know for a fact it was not the best strategy for a couple of teams, such as the Golden State Warriors, who just won their 70th win last night. Now, they're a team that's pretty home-built. They built through the draft, but did not build through tanking. They picked up players such as Klay Thompson, 30th pick, or Draymond Green, 60th pick. Players like that who really had potential, but weren't seen by other teams as having that potential. And they built a contender out of it. And last night, they showed why they might break the record for the most wins in an NBA season. They crushed the Spurs at Oracle Arena, Golden State's home arena, 112-101. And honestly, it wasn't even that close. The Spurs had a clutch, quotation marks, run at the end of the game 5-0 when the benches were in to make it look like it was actually a close game. The Spurs were rattled from the start. They stood almost no chance against the hounding Golden State defense. And they had poor shooting by LaMarcus Aldridge, Tony Parker, Tim Duncan. The entire starting lineup shot under 50% except for Kawhi Leonard, who had 23 points, which is very good. But he got most of his points after the lead was already insurmountable and they stood no chance. So they're very empty points. The team looked like they just could not hang on against the Warriors. And if they're hoping to beat the Warriors and go to the NBA Finals this year, they're going to need to be able to compete at the highest level with the Warriors fully healthy and engaged in the game. Because the only time the Spurs have beaten the Warriors this season was when the Warriors missed Andrew Bogut, Festus Ezeli, and Andre Iguodala. 3 of their 4 best defenders on the team were missing, and that was the only way the Spurs could beat them at the Spurs' home stadium. Honestly, it leaves a lot of doubt in my mind on whether or not the Spurs can actually compete with Golden State in the playoffs. To me, they just don't match up well with a hyper-athletic, young, hungry team like the Warriors. They're too old, they're slow. David West, Tim Duncan, Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili, all of these players are too slow to really lock down a quick team like the Golden State Warriors. Curry last night went off despite not really shooting well from 3. Instead of shooting from 3, he actually drove to the basket, passed it out to his teammates, had 27 points, 9 assists, 5 rebounds, and cut apart the Spurs defense. And it really showed that he was just too quick to be guarded by either Danny Green or Tony Parker. And supposedly, earlier in the season when the Spurs beat Curry and Golden State Warriors, supposedly they had learned the secret, this magical formula to beating the Warriors. Kawhi had supposedly shut down Klay Thompson, and Tony Parker / Danny Green had shut down Steph Curry, and they were going to beat them in the playoffs and show their stuff. And then Curry went off against them again. And they're 2-1 against the Spurs this season for a reason. Also, Draymond Green, 18 points, 7 assists, 6 rebounds. Klay Thompson had 6 assists. Harrison Barnes had 21 points. Bogut had 11 rebounds. Their entire starting lineup showed up against the Spurs, and the Spurs were flustered. They didn't know what to do. And it really showed last night. They didn't seem like they had an answer to any of the Golden State Warriors runs. Once the game was out of hand in the third quarter, when the Warriors went up by about 15 points, it was over. You could see the Spurs just kind of folded mentally, and they couldn't hang on. And honestly, I don't think that's going to do any different in the playoffs. I think the only team that can really stand a chance against the Warriors in the playoffs is the OKC Thunder. My reasoning behind that, of course, may seem a little controversial, but I feel like they have better players. I think that Russell Westbrook and Kevin Durant are better as a duo than Steph Curry and Klay Thompson. Obviously, some people may disagree with me, and you can try and write your arguments in the comments section, but I feel as though Russell Westbrook can at least compete athletically with Steph Curry. He's fast enough, he's strong enough, he's definitely quick enough on his first step to blow by Curry, who's not known to be a good defender. And I also think that he's also aware enough on defense and tough enough to at least attempt to slow down Steph Curry. I don't believe you can shut him down, but I think you can slow him down. And so I feel like Russell Westbrook can help contain him, and Kevin Durant is far and away better than Klay Thompson. That's not even close. You're talking about an MVP caliber player who's won the MVP in the past, in Kevin Durant, over a streaky shooting guard who can have hot nights and cold nights, has difficulty driving to the hoop, and has shown deficiencies when it comes to passing the ball out of double teams. And that's Klay Thompson. So, to me, the matchup is the star potential of that game. OKC seems like it has enough firepower in at least Russell Westbrook and Kevin Durant to compete with the Golden State Warriors. And I'm not saying that they're going to beat them and go to the finals, because I don't believe that. But I believe that compared to the Spurs, the Thunder actually stand a chance to win a few games against the Warriors. They've shown that they're athletic enough and they can score enough to keep up. And that's very different from the pride the Spurs put in defense, which the Thunder are not known for doing, to be honest. The Spurs can't really keep up offensively with the Golden State Warriors unless every single one of their players has a great night. LaMarcus Aldridge needs to play well, which means he can't dislocate his pinky like he did last night and affect his shooting. Tony Parker needs to have a resurgent series. Like, he needs to be transcendent. Ginobili needs to play and turn back the clock. Tim Duncan needs to play like he's always played, not like the declining Tim Duncan he is right now. And Kawhi needs to play out of his mind guarding Klay Thompson. If you haven't noticed, that's quite a few ifs and maybes in order to win against the Golden State Warriors. That's just too many factors going into the game, and it makes me feel like the Spurs can't hang with them, especially in the playoffs when the intensity is so much higher. However, the Spurs have a chance to prove me wrong on one of the biggest stages in NBA history. In 2 games, the Warriors will be going for a 72nd win, assuming they beat the Memphis Grizzlies. And that win will have to come on the Spurs' home court, a court which they have not lost on this entire year. And that would be an NBA record if they could complete the season undefeated at home. So we're talking about the regular season wins record versus the home record. And that's huge. It might be one of the biggest games in NBA history. Regular season, of course. So it's going to be one to watch. If the Spurs can show that they can beat the full-strength Warriors on their home court, they stand a chance in the NBA Western Conference Finals. Speaking of Western Conference Finals, I have a team that won't even sniff those finals unless they're in the crowd watching it. That's the Houston Rockets, who were fighting, as I told you yesterday, for a playoff spot, clinging to hopes on making the playoffs if the Mavericks or the Jazz decided to collapse at the end of the season. However, last night was the final blow. They lost 124-115 to the Phoenix Suns, a team that was really hoping to lose every game for the rest of the season, not win it. I'm almost at a loss for words at how disappointing the Rockets have been this season. They went from a team in the Western Conference Finals going toe-to-toe with the Golden State Warriors last year to a team that can't even get the 8th seed in the playoffs, and they have almost the same roster. And I can't understand it. Oh wait, yes I can. Their team fired their head coach Kevin McHale and decided to hire J.B. Bickerstaff, who is absolute trash. They also re-signed Corey Brewer, who can't play at all. All he can do is run fast breaks. Dwight Howard looks weaker, softer, and just not as dominant as he used to be. Harden is still carrying this team, but one player is not going to do it in the NBA. Look at LeBron back when he was in Cleveland. One of the best players of the generation, if not the best player we've seen in our lifetime, if you're my age. And yet, he couldn't carry a team to a championship. How can Harden do it? So the team is just not built to win. And honestly, it's disappointing to watch because I'd love to see Harden in the playoffs. Last year when he went toe-to-toe with Curry in Game 1, had 44 points, it was incredible. I love watching him play, but we won't be seeing any more of him once the regular season ends because his team disappointed again and again and again this season. And it bothers me so much because they have so much potential, but all they did was argue and fight, bicker with each other, almost Bickerstaff, and then failed to show up in every single game. They lost so many winnable games that would have pushed them over the edge into a playoff contender. And honestly, they don't deserve to be in the playoffs. I feel like that's really karma, almost. If you're not going to put in the work, then you don't deserve to be in the playoffs. And that's why the Houston Rockets lost last night and will not be playing later on in April. Now that's today's NBA Daily Podcast. Glad we ended it on such a positive note. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Dawson Shine, and I'll happily read any comments you have about the show.